Welcome to the Haunting Hour, where we bring your darkest fears to life through the chilling art of horror storytelling. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new tale creeping into the shadows. Whether you're looking to unwind, embrace the thrill of fear, or lose yourself in a world where the line between the living and the dead blurs, this is the place for you. Now dim the lights, settle in, and prepare to be haunted by tonight's story.
It all started with an invitation. The letter slipped under my door was a creamy off-white, its corners curling slightly as if it had been through a lot to get here. My name was scribbled in sharp, slanted handwriting across the front in black ink. The only other writing was a short, handwritten note inside. You're invited to the best Halloween night of your life. Costumes are required. Doors open at 11 p.m. Once you enter, there's no turning back. 17 Crossway Road. Don't be late. A grin spread across my face. I loved Halloween, and this invitation had legendary written all over it. Everyone at school had been talking about this party, whispering about how it would be at an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. A costume was mandatory, so I dug through my closet and found a decent black cloak, a mask with hollow eyes, and a pair of fake fangs. When 10:30 rolled around, I slipped out of the house, my heart beating faster with each step as I walked through the chilly October night towards 17 Crossway Road. I arrived at the mansion just as the grandfather clock inside struck 11. A shiver crawled down my spine as I stood in front of the decaying structure. Vines snaked up the walls, and shattered windows gaped at me like empty eyes. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking with the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Inside, dim lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out and grab at my feet. I stepped inside and nearly jumped out of my skin when the door slammed shut behind me. The chill grew sharper, pressing against my skin like needles. "Welcome, guests," a voice boomed from the shadows. I squinted to see a tall, thin figure standing at the top of the grand staircase. "The rules of tonight are simple. Enjoy yourselves. But remember," he leaned forward, his voice barely more than a whisper, "once you've entered, there's no turning back." The air felt thick, stifling. I looked around and saw other costume guests, all as uneasy as I was. My eyes lingered on a girl dressed as a ghost, her face pale beneath her mask. She looked at me, and I swear I saw a flicker of terror in her eyes. After a few forced introductions, the host announced the night's main event. "We have a tradition here," he said with a chilling smile. "Each year, we play a game to uncover the darkest fears of our guests. The winner," he paused, a strange glint in his eye, "survives until the morning." Nervous laughter echoed through the crowd, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my gut. We were all handed slips of paper with instructions to follow one of the mansion's fear rooms based on our assigned numbers. My paper read, "Room 7, Reflection Room." The hallway was dark as I crept toward Room 7. Shadows seemed to move, stretching and writhing as I walked by. I tried to ignore it, but something about this house felt alive. The door to Room 7 creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small space lined with mirrors, each dusty and cracked, reflecting warped versions of myself. As I stepped inside, I noticed my reflection seemed off. It was me, but not. My eyes were hollow and cold, and my mouth twisted into a grimace. The door shut behind me, leaving me alone with a reflection that seemed to move on its own. Then it began to whisper. The voice was soft, barely audible, yet I could feel it vibrating inside my skull. My reflection smiled, a slow, cruel stretch that made my skin crawl. "You don't belong here," it hissed. "You're nothing but prey in their game." I backed away, but the mirrors surrounded me on every side. My reflection's eyes grew darker, pupils dilating until they were pits of endless black. "What do you mean?" I stammered, my own voice quivering. "They chose you," it answered, its voice dripping with malice. "They're watching, feeding on your fear." I could feel my pulse in my ears, each beat louder than the last. Suddenly, the room began to shake. Mirrors splintered, glass shards falling around me as my reflection continued to stare, unblinking, with that cruel grin. And then, the door opened. Shaken, I stepped out, my legs trembling. The other guests had returned from their own rooms, and I could see the same haunted look in their eyes. Whatever they'd faced, it was as disturbing as mine. "Round 1 is complete," the host announced. "Round 2 begins now." As we moved to our next rooms, a scream shattered the silence. I turned to see the girl dressed as a ghost clutching her throat, her face a mask of terror. Her skin was draining of color, as if something was sucking the life out of her. "What's happening to her?" I whispered to a boy beside me. He just shook his head, his face pale. It was clear no one knew, and we were all helpless. One by one, the guests started to disappear. Some vanished into rooms and never came back. Others simply faded, as if the mansion itself was consuming them. Fear clawed at my chest, but I had to keep moving. The final room, room 13, was ahead of me, the door wide open, revealing a single chair in the middle of the room. The walls were smeared with red handprints, and the air smelled of rot. I took a step inside, my heart hammering. The door slammed shut, and I heard the lock click behind me. "Congratulations," the host's voice purred from somewhere in the darkness. "You're the last one." "Let me out!" I screamed, pounding on the door. "Oh, I can let you out," he whispered, close enough that I felt his breath on my neck. "But I need something in return." I looked down and saw a contract, a single line of text written in black ink. "Sign here, and you will be released from the mansion." My hands shook as I picked up the pen, but before I could sign, I looked up and saw my reflection in the mirror across the room. It was grinning, that same cruel smile from before. And it was holding a pen of its own. I dropped the pen, backing away as the reflection's grin widened. "You're ours now?" it whispered. The last thing I saw before the darkness closed in was my own reflection stepping out of the mirror, walking toward me as I faded, forever trapped within the walls of the mansion. Halloween night was always my favorite, especially when it fell on a weekend. This year, our town's annual masquerade was being held in the old Millwood Manor, a sprawling estate abandoned for decades. Everyone said it was haunted, but that only made it more exciting. My friends and I had all agreed to meet there, each of us wearing our best costumes. I'd gone for a vampire look, complete with a mask that hid my face from the nose up and some fake blood that dripped from the corners of my mouth. By the time I arrived, a dozen others were already milling around, their faces concealed under intricate masks. As I entered, a shiver ran down my spine. The house was dark, save for a few flickering candles lining the walls. Shadows played along the cracked wallpaper and dusty floor. And then I saw him, a tall figure in a simple, blank, white mask with hollow, black eyes. He stood still in the corner, barely moving. Something about him made me uneasy, but I brushed it off as part of the Halloween thrill. The party host, a girl from my class named Emily, welcomed everyone in her ghostly bride costume. She gestured to a table piled high with snacks and handed each of us a candle. "Tonight," she announced, "we're going to play a game. If you dare, that is." Emily gathered everyone in the main hall, where the faded chandelier above cast a haunting glow. The flickering candlelight made shadows dance across the walls, and the mood grew eerie as she explained the game. "Each of us will go to a different room and wait for a masked guest to find us," she said, her voice quivering with excitement. "When they find you, you'll get a clue leading you to the next room. Whoever finds all their clues first wins." It sounded easy enough, though the mention of a masked guest struck me as odd. Maybe it was a friend dressed up, or maybe Emily had hired someone to add some suspense. Either way, we were all game. One by one, we scattered throughout the manor. I chose the room at the end of the hall, an old study filled with dusty books and a desk covered in faded papers. As I stood in the dim room, the only sound was my own breathing. Minutes ticked by, and my candle's flame flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. Then, I felt it. A cold presence, almost like an icy breath against my neck. I turned slowly, my heart hammering, and saw the figure in the white mask standing in the doorway, staring at me. Without a word, he held out a crumpled note. My hands shook as I took it, and before I could say anything, he melted back into the shadows. The note was short, scrawled in thick black ink. "Find the room where secrets hide." I swallowed, glancing down the hall where the masked figure had disappeared. I moved quickly, determined not to lose the game. The library seemed the obvious choice. So I made my way there, my candle casting a pale light in front of me. The library was vast, the shelves lined with hundreds of forgotten books. I moved between the shelves, the silence pressing in on me. But then, the creak of the door behind me froze me in place. I turned to see him again. The masked figure, standing silently in the doorway. He stepped closer, his eyes unreadable behind the mask. There was something wrong about his presence. He didn't seem like anyone I knew. And yet, there was a strange familiarity about him. Without a word, he handed me another note, his cold fingers brushing against mine. As he disappeared once more, I read the second clue. In the room where time stands still. It didn't make much sense, but then I remembered the clock room, a small chamber with an antique grandfather clock that had stopped ticking long ago. The room was deathly quiet, the old clock looming over me like some silent judge. My candle was running low, the flame guttering, casting an ominous glow over the dusty clock face. Then, there was the faint sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing through the narrow hallway outside. My pulse raced as the steps grew closer, each one sending a wave of dread up my spine. The door creaked open, and there he was again. The masked guest, closer than ever, so close I could feel his cold breath. Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He tilted his head, saying nothing, and handed me another note. "Look behind you." With a sinking feeling, I turned, expecting to see something terrible reflected in the mirror by the clock, but the reflection was normal, save for the flickering light from my candle. I turned back, my heart pounding, and he was gone. I backed out of the room, shaken and unsure, my eyes darting around the dark hallway. Back in the main hall, I found some of my friends, pale and shaken, each holding their own notes. No one had seen Emily or any of the others who had set off earlier in the game. And then, one of my friends said something that made my blood run cold. Who was the guy in the mask?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. A chill ran down my spine. "You mean the guy that kept giving us notes?" Her face went white. There wasn't anyone else here. At that moment, the clock struck midnight, The lights flickered and the air grew deathly cold. We all looked at each other, a terrible realization sinking in. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the hall. One by one, people started disappearing, their screams cutting off abruptly, swallowed by the dark corners of the house. My own candle finally burned out, plunging me into darkness. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was the masked guest standing at the top of the staircase, holding the note I dropped. His hollow eyes seemed to bore into me as he whispered, "You're home now." And then everything went black. I didn't think twice about the invitation when it first arrived. It was the usual Halloween stuff. A mysterious handwritten letter slipped into my locker at school. I wasn't even sure how it got there. The front of the envelope just said my name in dark, elegant writing. Inside, the note read, "You're invited to play a game of shadows at St. Mary's Cemetery, 10 p.m. on Halloween night. Come alone if you dare." It sounded like the kind of creepy prank my friends might pull. Still, my curiosity got the better of me. Halloween night came around, and after promising my mom I'd only be gone a few hours, I headed out. The walk to the cemetery felt strange, and a chill settled over me as soon as I saw the gates looming in the fog. When I arrived, no one was there, just endless rows of gravestones and the weight of silence pressing down. But just as I was about to leave, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A shadow, tall and twisting, darting between the gravestones. "Hello?" I called, my voice swallowed by the dark. The shadow seemed to pause, as if it were waiting for me. That was when I heard it. A whisper, soft and haunting. "Welcome to the game." I spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but the cemetery was empty. The silence felt alive, almost pulsing with each shallow breath I took. Suddenly, another note drifted from above, landing at my feet. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers shaking. This one was typed, with instructions written in clean, precise lines. "In this game, there are rules. 1. Trust nothing you see. 2. Never step into another shadow. 3. Survive until dawn, and you win. The game begins. Now." A shiver ran down my spine. Part of me wanted to bolt, but my feet were frozen to the ground, and I felt an odd thrill, a strange mix of fear and excitement. But that excitement vanished when I noticed the shadows around me moving, inching closer as if they had minds of their own. A shadow suddenly slipped past my foot, sending a jolt through my body. I leaped back, my heart hammering as the shadow retreated. They weren't just shadows. They were part of the game. From somewhere nearby, the voice returned, whispering in a low, taunting tone, "Run, if you want to survive." I ran. Darting between headstones, I kept my eyes on the ground, careful not to let my shadow touch any of the dark shapes that slithered and stretched along the path. The shadows seemed to grow, lengthening and moving faster, twisting into shapes that didn't look human at all. My legs ached, and my breaths came in gasps as I found myself at the back of the cemetery, where the stones were older, cracked, and covered in thick vines. Just ahead, I saw a small mausoleum, its iron door slightly open. It was my only hope for a place to hide, so I slipped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The air was thick, smelling of damp earth and decay. I leaned against the stone wall, catching my breath. I thought I was safe until I looked around and noticed something etched into the walls, scratch marks. Hundreds of them, as if someone, or something, had tried to claw its way out. A fresh note lay on the ground by my feet. "You're not alone." Just as I read it, I heard the faintest scrape from the other side of the mausoleum. I turned, expecting to see one of the shadows pressing up against the walls, but instead, I saw a figure, thin, twisted, its face concealed by a dark hood, watching me from the corner. "Your turn," it whispered, voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. I bolted from the mausoleum, stumbling over roots and uneven stones as I fled into the open air. Behind me, I could hear faint footsteps, deliberate and slow, but gaining speed. I could feel something cold and heavy settle on my shoulders, like the shadows themselves were trying to drag me down. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw figures, dark, hollow shapes slipping in and out of the fog. They were all around me now, blocking paths and shifting closer, their dark forms reaching toward me with shadowy fingers. The words from the note replayed in my mind. Never step into another shadow. But it was impossible to avoid them all. I leaped over the shapes in front of me, twisting and turning, but my foot finally slipped, landing right in the middle of one of the dark pools cast by an ancient tombstone. Instantly, a shock of cold raced up my leg, and I felt as though I were sinking. Panic surged through me. I pulled my leg out, but when I looked down, I realized my own shadow had changed. It was no longer following me. It was twisting, moving independently, merging with the other shadows. "Don't you see?" a voice whispered, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You're already one of us." My breaths were coming in short, shallow gasps as I kept moving, desperate to escape. But no matter how fast I ran, the shadows kept shifting, always keeping pace. I was lost in a maze of darkness, my only landmarks the pale gravestones peeking out of the fog. Finally, I reached the cemetery gates, and hope surged in my chest. They were still open, just a few yards away. But as I sprinted closer, something blocked my path. A figure cloaked in darkness, standing tall and still, its face hidden beneath a hood. The figure held out one hand, and I realized it was holding the final note. Slowly, I took it, my fingers trembling as I read the last words. "You played well, but this is the end. You are now one of us." The figure stepped back, vanishing into the shadows as the gates swung shut with a heavy clang. A crushing darkness closed in around me, and I felt my body grow cold, my limbs stiff. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. As the first light of dawn broke over the cemetery, I saw the shadows retreat, slipping back into the ground. I reached out, trying to feel the warmth of the sun, but my hand had become nothing more than a shadow against the stone path. I was trapped, forever bound to the cemetery, just another shade in the game of shadows, waiting for the next foolish player who dared to enter.
Thank you for joining me tonight on The Haunting Hour. If these stories sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps me bring more chilling tales straight to your screen. If you're not yet part of our ghostly gathering, click subscribe and ring the bell to not miss out on any of our haunted adventures. And I'm curious, which story tonight creeped you out the most? Drop a comment below to let us know. Your favorite stories fuel our dark fires and inspire more spooky tales. Also, what kind of scary stories do you want to hear next? Tell me in the comments. Your wish might just become our next nightmare. Until next time, keep the lights on and keep the spirits at bay. Good night, and remember, never venture alone into the dark.